The silence that followed Maya's revelation lasted only seconds before the gate area erupted into chaos. Passengers immediately began talking among themselves. Phones appeared to capture photos and videos, and several people stepped forward to offer their accounts of what they had witnessed. Jennifer stood frozen behind the counter, her face now completely pale as she stared at Maya's federal identification badge. Rick Stevens, the gate supervisor, was the first to recover from the shock. His 15 years of airline experience had taught him to handle difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for the reality that his employee had just destroyed the diplomatic passport of a federal aviation inspector. His hands shook as he reached for his radio to call airport security and his district manager. Airport security to Gate B-17. Immediate supervisor response required. Rick's voice cracked as he made the announcement. Within minutes, the gate area would be swarming with security personnel, federal agents, and airline executives, trying to contain what was already shaping up to be a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Maya carefully placed her FAA badge back in her briefcase and knelt down to collect the torn pieces of her diplomatic passport from the floor. Each piece would serve as evidence in the federal investigation that was sure to follow. As she gathered the fragments of the navy blue cover and official pages, she noticed that some passengers were taking pictures of the destroyed document, creating additional evidence of the incident. Jennifer finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know, I thought, she stammered, but the words died in her throat as she realized there was no explanation that could justify what she had done. The enormity of her actions was finally sinking in, and tears began to form in her eyes as she understood that her career with the airline was over. I need to make some phone calls, Maya said to Rick, her voice professional but firm. I'll need a private area where I can contact my supervisor and begin the formal incident reporting process. Rick nodded quickly and led Maya to a small office behind the gate counter. The space was cramped and filled with computer terminals, scheduling boards, and stacks of paperwork, but it would provide the privacy Maya needed to make her calls. As they walked, Rick kept apologizing profusely, though Maya could tell his concern was more about protecting his own job than about making amends for the discrimination she had experienced. Once inside the office, Maya pulled out her secure government phone and dialed her supervisor, Director James Harrison at FAA headquarters in Washington. D.C. Harrison was a 25-year veteran of federal aviation oversight who had hired Maya personally and had been mentoring her career advancement for the past 5 years. When he answered the call, his voice was warm and relaxed, suggesting he was expecting a routine check-in from one of his undercover inspectors. Maya, how's the Chicago inspection going? Finding anything interesting? Harrison asked cheerfully. Sir, we have a significant incident, Maya replied, her voice taking on the formal tone she used for serious official business. I need to report the destruction of my diplomatic passport by airline personnel during an apparent act of racial discrimination. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Harrison responded. Repeat that, Inspector Thompson. Did you say your diplomatic passport was destroyed? Maya provided a detailed account of everything that had occurred, from her observations of discriminatory treatment toward other passengers to the specific actions Jennifer had taken in tearing up her official government document. Harrison listened without interruption, though Maya could hear him typing rapidly on his keyboard, likely taking notes and beginning the formal incident documentation process. Maya, this is now a federal incident involving potential civil rights violations and destruction of government property, Harrison said when she finished her report. I am immediately notifying the Transportation Security Administration, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the State Department about the passport destruction. Do not leave that location until federal agents arrive to take your statement. While Maya was on the phone, the situation at the gate continued to deteriorate for the airline. Airport security had arrived and cordoned off the area around the counter where the incident had occurred. Word was spreading rapidly throughout the terminal. and news reporters were already beginning to arrive after being alerted by passengers who had posted about the incident on social media. Jennifer Walsh had been escorted to the airport security office, where she sat in a small, windowless room trying to process what had happened. Her supervisor from the airline's district office had arrived and was asking her to explain her actions, but Jennifer struggled to articulate why she had been so suspicious of Maya's documents. As she tried to describe her thought process, it became increasingly clear that her decisions had been based on racial assumptions rather than any legitimate security concerns. She had 2 passports, Jennifer kept repeating, as if this somehow justified her actions, and she was acting suspicious. The district supervisor, Angela Martinez, had been with the airline for 12 years and had handled numerous personnel issues, but nothing quite like this. As she listened to Jennifer's explanation, it became obvious that the young gate agent had received inadequate training about both customer service and recognizing official government documents. Jennifer, diplomatic passports are completely legitimate for federal employees, Angela explained patiently. Many government workers carry both diplomatic and personal passports for different types of travel. That's standard procedure, not suspicious behavior. But Jennifer seemed unable to grasp this concept. In her mind, she had done everything right by being vigilant about security. The possibility that her judgment had been clouded by racial bias was something she either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Even as the evidence of her discriminatory treatment became increasingly obvious to everyone around her. Meanwhile, federal agents were beginning to arrive at O'Hare Airport. Special Agent Robert Kim from the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been dispatched from the Chicago field office, while TSA investigators were en route to examine the incident from an aviation security perspective. The State Department was also sending a representative to address the destruction of the diplomatic passport, which fell under their jurisdiction. Maya spent the next 2 hours providing detailed statements to various federal agencies. Each interview required her to recount the events from slightly different perspectives, focusing on different aspects of the incident that were relevant to each agency's area of responsibility. The FBI was primarily interested in the civil rights implications and the pattern of discriminatory behavior she had observed. The TSA wanted to understand how the incident might affect aviation security protocols and training. The State Department needed to document the passport destruction for their own investigation and to begin the process of issuing Maya a replacement diplomatic document. Throughout these interviews, Maya maintained her professional composure, but she couldn't help thinking about her parents and the sacrifices they had made for her education and career. Her father, who had cleaned office buildings for 30 years, and her mother, who had worked double shifts at the hospital, had always told her that education and hard work would protect her from discrimination. Yet here she was, at the highest levels of federal service, still experiencing the same prejudiced treatment that Black Americans had faced for generations. The incident was also having ripple effects throughout the aviation industry. Word had spread quickly among FAA personnel, airline executives, and airport security officials across the country. Maya's reputation as a thorough and fair inspector was well known within the industry, and the fact that she had been subjected to such treatment sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Director Harrison arrived at O'Hare Airport later that afternoon, having taken the first available flight from Washington. He was accompanied by 2 senior FAA investigators and a representative from the agency's Office of Civil Rights. As Maya's supervisor and mentor, Harrison was both personally outraged by what had happened to her and professionally concerned about the implications for FAA oversight operations. Maya, I want you to know that the agency is treating this as a serious federal incident, Harrison told her when they met in a conference room at the airport. We're not just talking about an airline employee making a mistake. This appears to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior that could affect the safety and security of aviation operations. Harrison explained that the FAA would be conducting a comprehensive review of the airline's training procedures, hiring practices, and oversight protocols. If the investigation revealed systemic problems with discrimination, the airline could face federal sanctions, including restrictions on their operating permits and substantial financial penalties. The airline's executives were frantically trying to manage the crisis. The company's president, Richard Walsh, had flown in from the corporate headquarters, and teams of lawyers and public relations specialists were working around the clock to develop a response strategy. However, their efforts were complicated by the fact that videos of the incident were already going viral. Dr. Maya Thompson adjusted her simple black blazer and checked her watch as she approached the departure gate at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on the bustling terminal, where travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases and coffee cups. Maya carried only a small leather briefcase and wore no jewelry except for a modest pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother at 38 years old. Maya had earned her position as one of the youngest Federal Aviation Administration inspectors in the agency's history. Her journey to this role had been anything but easy. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, she had been the daughter of a school janitor and a hospital cleaning lady. Both her parents had worked multiple jobs to save money for her education. Believing that knowledge was the one thing nobody could ever take away from their daughter, Maya had studied aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech, where she was often the only black woman in her classes. She remembered the countless nights spent in the library, proving herself again and again to professors and classmates who seemed surprised by her presence. After graduation, she had worked for several airlines before joining the FAA, where she had spent the last 12 years climbing the ranks through dedication and an unwavering attention to detail. Today's assignment was routine but important. Maya was traveling undercover to inspect safety procedures at various airports across the country. Her job required her to observe how airport staff handled security protocols, passenger services, and emergency procedures without revealing her identity as a federal inspector. She had conducted dozens of these undercover inspections throughout her career, and they were crucial for maintaining aviation safety standards. The gate area was crowded with passengers, waiting for Flight 447 to Atlanta. Maya chose a seat near the boarding area where she could observe the gate agents and their interactions with travelers. She pulled out a book to appear like any other passenger, but her trained eyes were constantly watching and noting details about the operation. Behind the counter, 2 gate agents were working. The supervisor was a middle-aged white man named Rick Stevens, who had been with the airline for 15 years. Next to him stood Jennifer Walsh, a younger woman in her 20s who had been promoted to lead gate agent just 6 months earlier. Jennifer had strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and wore the standard airline uniform with several pins indicating her various certifications and achievements. Maya noticed that Jennifer seemed to handle most of the passenger interactions while Rick focused on paperwork and computer tasks. As boarding time approached, Maya watched Jennifer's interactions with different passengers. With white business travelers, Jennifer was professional and efficient, often smiling and making small talk about their destinations. When elderly passengers or families with children approached, she showed patience and offered extra assistance. However, Maya began to notice a pattern that made her stomach tighten with familiar disappointment. When black passengers approached the counter, Jennifer's demeanor changed noticeably. Her smile disappeared, her responses became shorter and more clipped, and she seemed to scrutinize their documents more carefully than she had with other travelers. Maya had experienced this kind of treatment herself countless times over the years, but seeing it happen to others still filled her with a mixture of anger and sadness. One particular interaction caught Maya's attention. A young black college student approached the counter with questions about his connecting flight. Jennifer barely looked up from her computer screen as she answered his questions in a monotone voice, providing the minimum information required, without any of the helpful details she had offered to other passengers just minutes before. The student walked away looking confused and frustrated, clearly not having received the assistance he needed. Maya made mental notes of these observations, knowing they would be important for her report. As a federal inspector, she was trained to document patterns of discriminatory behavior that could indicate systemic problems within an airline's operations. Discrimination not only violated federal civil rights laws but could also impact passenger safety. If certain travelers were not receiving proper assistance or information as boarding began, Maya waited for her group to be called. She had deliberately chosen a seat in a later boarding group to maximize her observation time. When Group C was finally announced, she gathered her briefcase and joined the line of passengers waiting to board. The line moved slowly as Jennifer checked each passenger's boarding pass and identification. Maya watched as the gate agent processed each person efficiently, occasionally making pleasant comments to some passengers while remaining strictly business-like with others. The pattern of differential treatment continued, though it was subtle enough that most passengers probably wouldn't notice unless they were specifically looking for it. When Maya reached the front of the line, she handed Jennifer her boarding pass and driver's license with a polite smile. Jennifer took the documents and began examining them with what seemed like unusual scrutiny. She held Maya's driver's license up to the light, turned it over several times, and compared the photo to Maya's face with an intensity that seemed excessive. "This doesn't look right," Jennifer announced loudly, causing several other passengers in line to turn and stare. "The photo doesn't match, and this ID looks suspicious." Maya felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice calm and level. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean. That's my valid driver's license, and I assure you the photo is accurate." Jennifer continued to examine the license, making a show of comparing it to Maya's face. "The skin tone in this photo doesn't match what I'm seeing," she declared with conviction. "And the facial structure looks different. I think this might be a fake ID." Other passengers in line began to murmur among themselves, and Maya could feel dozens of eyes on her. She had been in situations like this before, but never while conducting an official federal inspection. Her training told her to maintain her cover and see how the situation unfolded. But her personal instincts wanted to immediately reveal her identity and put an end to this humiliating treatment. "Ma'am, I understand your concerns about security, but this is definitely my license," Maya said firmly. "Perhaps you could have your supervisor take a look?" But Rick was busy with another task and didn't seem to notice what was happening. Jennifer shook her head and held up Maya's driver's license again. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I call security. This ID is clearly fraudulent." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maya realized that Jennifer was not just being overly cautious about security, she was making assumptions based on Maya's race and appearance. In Jennifer's mind, a well-dressed black woman with a Georgia driver's license traveling on business must somehow be suspicious or fraudulent. "I need to see your passport as well," Jennifer demanded. Extending her hand expectantly, Maya hesitated for a moment. She carried a diplomatic passport due to her federal position, but revealing it would blow her cover and end her inspection. However, she also knew that she needed to document this situation properly, and complying with Jennifer's request might provide more evidence of discriminatory treatment. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her navy blue diplomatic passport, handing it to Jennifer along with her regular tourist passport that she carried for personal travel. Jennifer's eyes widened slightly when she saw the diplomatic passport. But rather than showing appropriate respect for an official government document, her expression hardened with suspicion. "Two passports?" Jennifer said loudly, holding both documents up for other passengers to see. "That's definitely suspicious. Nobody travels with two passports unless they're up to something illegal." Maya felt a surge of disbelief at Jennifer's ignorance about diplomatic travel procedures, but she maintained her composure. Many federal employees carry both diplomatic and personal passports for different types of travel, she explained patiently. Jennifer wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind that Maya was some kind of criminal or fraud. In her limited worldview, a black woman with official documents had to be pretending to be someone she wasn't. The possibility that Maya might legitimately hold an important government position seemed beyond Jennifer's comprehension. What happened next would haunt Maya for months to come. Jennifer, apparently deciding that Maya's passports were somehow fraudulent, took hold of the diplomatic passport and began tearing it in half. The distinctive navy blue cover split apart in her hands, and the official pages with Maya's photo and government seals scattered onto the floor. The gate area fell completely silent. Even the background noise of the busy airport seemed to fade away as passengers and airline staff stared in shock at what had just occurred. Maya stood frozen, watching pieces of her official government document lying on the floor around Jennifer's feet. "There," Jennifer announced with satisfaction. "That should put an end to whatever scam you were trying to pull." Maya's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. A gate agent had just destroyed an official United States diplomatic passport issued by the Department of State. Not only was this a serious criminal offense, but it was also an attack on. 3 months after the incident at Chicago O'Hare Airport, Maya Thompson sat in a packed congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before the House Subcommittee on Aviation Safety and Civil Rights. The hearing, titled Discrimination in Air Travel, Ensuring Equal Treatment for All Passengers, had drawn national media attention and representatives from civil rights organizations, airline industry groups, and passenger advocacy organizations. Maya looked out at the gallery filled with reporters, activists, and airline executives, many of whom had become familiar faces over the past few months as the story had dominated aviation industry news. The incident that had started as a routine undercover inspection had evolved into a watershed moment for addressing systemic discrimination in air travel. Committee Chairman Robert Martinez, a congressman from California, called the hearing to order and introduced Maya as the first witness. As she adjusted the microphone and prepared to speak, Maya reflected on how much had changed since that day in Chicago when Jennifer Walsh had torn up her diplomatic passport. "Distinguished members of the committee," Maya began, her voice clear and professional, "my name is Dr. Maya Thompson, and I serve as a senior aviation safety inspector with the Federal Aviation Administration. I appear before you today not just as a federal employee, but as a citizen who experienced firsthand the kind of discrimination that continues to plague our aviation system." Maya's testimony provided a detailed account of the incident, but she also placed it in the broader context of her investigation findings. The federal inquiry that followed had uncovered extensive evidence of discriminatory practices at multiple levels of airline operations, from passenger services to hiring and promotion decisions. The investigation had revealed that Jennifer Walsh's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that existed throughout the airline industry. Federal investigators had interviewed hundreds of employees and passengers, reviewed training materials, and analyzed complaint records from multiple airlines. The results painted a disturbing picture of institutionalized discrimination that had been largely ignored by industry oversight. "The destruction of my diplomatic passport was shocking, but it was not the most significant discovery of our investigation," Maya continued. "What we found was a systematic failure to address discriminatory behavior, inadequate training on civil rights obligations, and a corporate culture that prioritized efficiency over equality." Jennifer Walsh herself had become the most visible symbol of these problems. In the weeks following the incident, she had been terminated by the airline, arrested on federal charges, and subjected to intense media scrutiny. During her criminal proceedings, more details had emerged about her background and the factors that had contributed to her discriminatory behavior. Jennifer's lawyer, David Chun, had attempted to portray her as a well-meaning employee who had made an honest mistake while trying to protect aviation security. However, the federal investigation had uncovered social media posts where Jennifer had made racist comments and complained about having to serve passengers of color. Text messages between Jennifer and other airline employees revealed a pattern of discriminatory attitudes that had been developing for years. During her sentencing hearing, Jennifer had finally acknowledged the severity of her actions and expressed remorse for the pain she had caused. She received 80 months in federal prison for destruction of government property and violation of civil rights, along with 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory participation in diversity education programs. "I want to apologize to Dr. Thompson, and to all the passengers I treated unfairly, Jennifer had said during her sentencing. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that my actions were wrong and hurtful. I hope that something positive can come from this terrible mistake. Maya had watched Jennifer's sentencing from the gallery, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the incident had also destroyed a young woman's life and career. Maya hoped that Jennifer's punishment would send a clear message to other airline employees about the consequences of discriminatory behavior. The airline itself had faced severe consequences as well. The Federal Aviation Administration had imposed a record-breaking fine of $50 million for safety and civil rights violations. The company had been required to implement comprehensive diversity training for all employees, establish new oversight procedures for customer service interactions, and submit to federal monitoring for the next 5 years. Rick Stevens, the gate supervisor who had failed to intervene during the incident, had also been terminated and faced federal charges for his role in allowing the discrimination to occur. His case had highlighted the responsibility of supervisors to protect passengers from discriminatory treatment by their subordinates. The airline's president, Richard Walsh, had resigned under pressure from the board of directors and shareholders. The company's stock price had plummeted in the aftermath of the incident, and several major corporate customers had canceled their travel contracts in protest of the discriminatory treatment, but the most significant changes had occurred at the policy level. Maya's testimony and the federal investigation had prompted Congress to pass the Aviation Civil Rights Act, which established new training requirements for airline employees, mandatory reporting procedures for discrimination incidents, and enhanced penalties for violations of passenger civil rights. This legislation ensures that what happened to me will have meaningful consequences for the entire industry, Maya told the Congressional Committee. It creates accountability mechanisms that didn't exist before and gives passengers real recourse when they experience discrimination. The new law required all airline employees to complete annual civil rights training that included specific modules on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Airlines were also required to establish independent civil rights officers who would investigate discrimination complaints and report directly to federal oversight agencies. Maya had been personally involved in developing these training programs, working with civil rights organizations and industry experts to create comprehensive curricula that addressed both legal requirements and practical customer service situations. The programs included scenario-based training where employees practiced handling interactions with diverse passengers and learned to recognize their own unconscious biases. Education is the key to preventing future incidents, Maya explained during her testimony. Employees need to understand not just the legal requirements, but also the human impact of discriminatory treatment on passengers and their families. The ripple effects of the incident had extended far beyond the aviation industry. Maya had received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination while traveling, and her story had inspired other federal inspectors and investigators to be more vigilant about civil rights violations in their own areas of responsibility. Maya had also become a sought-after speaker at conferences and universities, where she talked about the importance of diversity in federal service and the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America. Her speeches often focused on the role that individual actions could play in either perpetuating or challenging systemic discrimination. One of Maya's most meaningful experiences had been speaking at her old high school in Georgia, where she addressed an auditorium full of students who looked like her younger self. Many of them came from similar backgrounds of economic hardship and racial discrimination, and Maya wanted them to understand that education and perseverance could open doors that might seem permanently closed. When that gate agent tore up my passport, she thought she was putting me in my place, Maya had told the students. She couldn't imagine that a black woman from rural Georgia could hold an important federal position. Your dreams and ambitions are valid, regardless of what anyone else thinks about your potential. The incident had also strengthened Maya's relationship with her parents, who had watched with pride as their daughter's courage and professionalism had led to meaningful reforms. Her father had kept every newspaper article about the incident and the subsequent investigation, creating a scrapbook that he showed to friends and neighbors as evidence of what education and hard work could accomplish. During her congressional testimony, Maya had made sure to honor her parents' sacrifices and acknowledge the support she had received from colleagues and mentors throughout her career. She particularly thanked Director Harrison, who had stood by her throughout the investigation and had been instrumental in pushing for the policy changes that emerged from the incident. The hearing had also featured testimony from passengers who had experienced discrimination while traveling, airline executives who were implementing the new civil rights training programs, and civil rights advocates who were monitoring the industry's progress in addressing these issues. One particularly powerful moment came when Maria Santos, a Latina business executive from Texas, described how she had been repeatedly selected for random additional screening at airports across the country. Her testimony illustrated how discrimination could manifest in subtle but humiliating ways that made travel stressful and degrading for passengers of color.